Mass starvation was not collateral damage. It was anticipated. Millions of Soviet civilians died under occupation. Approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved or killed. Entire villages in Belarus and Ukraine were destroyed in reprisal operations. This was not random wartime excess. It was the application of racial hierarchy through bureaucracy. Orders were written, quotas were set, rail schedules were organized, administrative departments coordinated deportations. Anti-Slavic racism became state architecture. Ideology provided justification, and hierarchy became demographic design. In previous centuries, Slavs had been described as backward, as peasants, as politically unreliable. Now those older narratives fused with biological racism. Between 1939 and 1945, millions of Slavic civilians were killed through execution, forced labor, starvation policy, and ethnic cleansing. The Nazi regime did not design a single unified extermination plan for all Slavs in the same way it did for Jews. But it did design a future in which large parts of Eastern Europe would be emptied, reduced, or permanently subordinated. This is the moment when anti-Slavic racism becomes fully bureaucratized. When the war ends in 1945, the Nazi state collapses. Its plans fail. But the destruction leaves deep scars across Eastern Europe, and the hierarchies that justified it do not disappear overnight. They change form. In 1945, the Nazi regime collapses. Its racial empire is defeated. And across Europe, overt biological racism becomes publicly discredited. The language of master races and subhumans is no longer politically acceptable. But hierarchy does not disappear. It changes vocabulary. The continent is quickly divided. On one side, the United States and Western Europe. On the other, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. An ideological curtain falls across the continent, and a new binary replaces older racial language. Not superior and inferior races, but West and East. Freedom and authoritarianism. Capitalism and communism. Post-war rejection of biological racism creates a rhetorical vacuum. Cold War geopolitical division fills it, and geopolitical competition requires narrative simplification. In the United States, defending capitalism becomes a central ideological mission. American propaganda throughout the Cold War emphasizes prosperity, consumer abundance, individual freedom. By contrast, communist states are portrayed as gray, rigid, economically stagnant. The imagery is powerful. Supermarkets versus breadlines, suburbs versus concrete housing blocks, democracy versus surveillance. Most Slavic majority countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, much of the Soviet Union, fall inside the communist sphere. And over time, political ideology begins to bleed into cultural perception. Communist becomes associated with Eastern European. Eastern European becomes associated with backwardness. Backwardness becomes moralized. The hierarchy is now civilizational, not biological. Modern versus primitive. Efficient versus corrupt. Rational versus unstable. There were important distinctions. Yugoslavia, under Tito, was not part of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc. After 1948, it broke with Stalin. It pursued a non-aligned path. It allowed more travel, more cultural openness, more economic flexibility than many Warsaw Pact states. Yet in Western imagination, nuance often collapses. Everything east of the Iron Curtain, and sometimes even beyond it, becomes the East. And the East becomes a single mental category. This flattening matters, because once a region is coded as a monolith, its internal diversity disappears, and stereotypes become easier to sustain. Throughout the Cold War, Eastern Europe is frequently portrayed in Western media as oppressive, economically inefficient, politically immature. These descriptions are often directed at regimes, but they bleed into perceptions of people. Anti-Slavic prejudice does not present itself as racial theory anymore. It appears as cultural commentary, jokes about corruption, assumptions about criminality, narratives about poor hygiene or disorder. The language shifts, but the structure remains familiar. Biological hierarchy becomes taboo. Civilizational hierarchy replaces it. Geopolitical rivalry reinforces it, and cultural stereotypes normalize it. By the late 1980s, the Cold War begins to dissolve. Communist governments fall. The Iron Curtain lifts. But the mental map of Europe, West as advanced, East as lagging, has been deeply ingrained. And when post-socialist economic crises unfold in the 1990s, those older hierarchies find new confirmation. The rhetoric may have changed, but the ranking never fully disappeared. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe fall within a few years. For many countries, this is a moment of liberation, but it is also a moment of shock. State industries collapse, unemployment rises sharply, inflation spirals in some regions, social safety nets weaken. Entire economic systems must be rebuilt almost overnight. The transition from planned economies to market capitalism is not gradual. It is abrupt. Economic collapse produces instability. Instability produces migration. At the same time, the Balkan Wars erupt, and Western media must explain a complex region quickly. In the 1990s, wars in Croatia, Bosnia, and later Kosovo dominate headlines. Television audiences in Western Europe and North America are suddenly confronted with images of ethnic violence in the Balkans. The explanations offered are often simplified. Ancient hatreds, tribal conflict, Balkan chaos. These phrases compress centuries of political history into a single idea: inherent irrationality. Violence is not explained as the product of collapsing federations, economic breakdown, nationalist mobilization, or political manipulation. It is framed as cultural inevitability. This framing matters because once violence is described as ancient and tribal, it feels timeless. And if it feels timeless, it feels natural. At the same time, migration from Eastern Europe increases. Workers from Poland, Romania, the Baltics, and the Balkans move westward in search of opportunity. Economic disparities between Western and Eastern Europe are highly visible. An economic difference quickly becomes moralized. Migration anxiety merges with older stereotypes. Eastern Europeans are portrayed in tabloids and political rhetoric as cheap labor, benefit exploiters, organized crime networks, human traffickers, corrupt officials. The vocabulary is no longer about race, it is about economy and security. But the hierarchy remains. The 1990s create a new mass-market image. Not the medieval captive, not the 19th century inferior race, not the Cold War communist, but the post-communist migrant. Poor, unstable, potentially dangerous. Entire regions are flattened into caricature. Balkanization becomes shorthand for fragmentation. Eastern Europe becomes shorthand for dysfunction, and complexity disappears. Economic shock plus media simplification plus migration anxiety produces updated hierarchy. Old narratives adapt to new language. Backward becomes underdeveloped. Uncivilized becomes corrupt. Inferior becomes unreliable. The Iron Curtain has fallen, but the mental curtain remains. Western Europe is still imagined as the center, Eastern Europe as the periphery. And although political systems have changed, the ranking persists. By the early 2000s, as European Union expansion accelerates, these perceptions will take on a new dimension, because mobility will make hierarchy visible inside the same political space. And the question will no longer be abstract, it will be personal. In 2004, the European Union expands dramatically. 8 post-communist countries join in a single wave, followed by more in 2007 and 2013. For the first time, large parts of Eastern Europe are integrated into a shared political and economic space with Western Europe. And with that integration comes something powerful: free movement. Citizens of Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and other new member states gain the right to work in wealthier EU countries. Millions move westward over the following years. Construction workers, caregivers, engineers, nurses, students. The movement is legal, structured, institutional. EU enlargement creates mobility. Mobility creates labor market competition. Competition creates stratification, and stratification creates hierarchy. Western labor markets do not absorb newcomers evenly. Many migrants from Eastern Europe enter lower-wage sectors: construction, agriculture, cleaning, logistics, domestic care work. Over time, a pattern becomes visible. Eastern Europeans are associated with certain types of labor. In the mid-2000s, the phrase Polish plumber circulates in Western European political debates. It becomes shorthand, not just for a worker, but for wage competition, for outsourcing, for fear of standards being undercut. The stereotype carries contradictions. Eastern Europeans are described as hard-working, reliable, willing to do difficult jobs, but also as threats: too cheap, too numerous, too willing to lower wages. Researchers describe this as ambiguous racialization. Eastern Europeans are categorized as white, but not fully equal within Western social hierarchies. They occupy a middle position, needed economically, devalued socially. The logic mirrors older patterns. They are not biologically inferior, but they are culturally suspect, not uncivilized, but less refined, not disloyal, but potentially opportunistic. Public debates sometimes amplify resentment. Narratives about migrants stealing jobs, abusing welfare systems, undermining labor protections. These claims often exaggerate or distort economic realities, but they resonate during periods of financial strain. After the 2008 financial crisis, such narratives intensify. Economic insecurity in Western Europe revives older anxieties. Migration becomes politicized, and Eastern Europeans become visible symbols in larger arguments about globalization and sovereignty. Free movement creates proximity. Proximity reveals inequality. Inequality triggers status defense. Status defense revives stereotype. Today, anti-Slavic racism rarely appears in explicit racial theory. It appears as classed xenophobia, as jokes about fraud or corruption, as cultural contempt, references to an uncivilized East, as suspicion about loyalty, especially in geopolitical tensions, and sometimes, in moments of heightened crisis, as direct ethnic slurs. The language is modern, the structure is old. Hierarchy persists, not through law codes or settlement commissions, but through labor markets, media framing, and social perception. Across centuries, the vocabulary has changed, from slave markets to frontier peasants, to inferior races, to communist blocs, to migrant workers. But the underlying question remains the same: who belongs at the center of Europe, and who remains at its periphery? In global cultural hierarchies, Western Europe and North America are still widely imagined as the benchmark of modernity. Eastern Europe is often described as catching up, developing, transitioning, recovering. These words may sound neutral, but they carry ranking. When corruption scandals occur in Eastern Europe, they are framed as cultural symptoms. When they occur in Western Europe, they are framed as political failures. When economic hardship appears in the East, it is often described as structural weakness. When it appears in the West, it is described as crisis. Subtle differences, but meaningful ones. The legacy of hierarchy shapes expectations. It shapes jokes. It shapes hiring decisions. It shapes media framing. It shapes who is assumed competent and who must prove it. Understanding anti-Slavic racism is not about reopening old divisions. It is about recognizing patterns. How economic competition becomes moral judgment. How political insecurity becomes demographic fear. How cultural difference becomes ranked civilization. And how those rankings can persist long after the original conditions have changed. History leaves residue. Ideas outlive regimes. Narratives survive revolutions. Thank you for watching.